Today we are continuing in our series, In the Arena, part 3 of In the Arena. And our theme for this series has been that we are created to be initiators, not spectators. A new year stretches out before us, and the question is, will you be an initiator or will you be a spectator? Will you be a spectator or will you be a difference maker? And I think for all of us, that there are certain diversions that we occupy ourselves with, that we are interested in to some degree or another, things that we're interested in but we really can't do anything about. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's politics, maybe it's the news or the weather, which we can't usually do anything about, but except this weekend, there was definitely something we need to do about in response to that. Maybe it's reading a fiction book, it's movies, TV, a play, whatever. But in all of those things that we really have very little control, or if any control, if you're not an athlete or a coach or a meteorologist or a journalist or you're involved in government or you're an actor, you're not going to have much influence or in any say at all in how things turn out. You are a spectator. It is a diversion. But what happens for some people, and I'm sure this is not the case for any of you, but for some people, the diversion becomes an obsession. And more energy and emotional energy and time is poured into the diversion for something you are not responsible for and have little to no influence in, and that which you are responsible for is neglected. Your kids, your spouse, your job, your career, your relationships, those are perhaps negatively affected, that which you are responsible for, because of greater priority for what you're not responsible for. Basically, what has happened is that we trade what we are responsible for what we're not responsible for. We've turned from initiators into spectators. And what naturally happens when our attention and emotional energy is all focused all the time, or at least most of the time, on that which we have no control over, it leads to frustration. Naturally, as you would expect. You can't change. You wouldn't. Why do they call that fake field goal? You've been fuming over that. Or why did that politician make that decision? It ruined you. You have no influence. You don't call the plays. You don't have the votes in Congress. You don't do all of that stuff. But yet, what happens is that it's just like it's frustrating. And so that's why we become critics. Spectators are known as critics. Spectators criticize difference makers. They capitalize on their opportunities. Whereas spectators can have no responsibility, difference makers take responsibility. And so what happens, instead of cursing the darkness, difference makers get involved in spreading the light. They leverage the influence that they have, the opportunity that they have to leverage influence to get involved, to make a difference. And that's what our Theodore Roosevelt talked about as a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which has been our theme for this, or where the whole title for this series came from. It was in the front pages of a book called Wild at Heart that I read like 17, 18 years ago that changed my life. This is what Teddy Roosevelt said. He said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." If I ever lead an army into battle, that's what I'm going to say. Before we do that, if I to lead the troops into battle, or lead maybe your team onto the field, whatever, to be in the arena. And so we are called to be in the arena, to be those kind of people, not the critic, not the spectator. We're called to be initiators. But this raises the question, if I'm to be an initiator, if I'm to be in the arena, what arena am I to be involved in? In what arena am I to be involved? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because Jesus, we see, was very much about getting His disciples into the arena. Very much about turning spectators into initiators. And for those first few months, several months, the disciples were spectators. They watched Jesus do it all. They watched Jesus spellbind the audiences, the crowds with His teaching. They watched Jesus cast out evil spirits. They watched Jesus heal. They watched Jesus multiply, do incredible miracles. But now the time has come where Jesus is turning them from spectators into initiators. He's sending them out into the arena. And the particular arena that He is sending them out into, He describes it as the harvest or the harvest field. And He talks about this in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. It's recounted in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're looking at Luke's version today in Luke chapter 10. And this is what it says. This is after this. In Luke chapter 10, before this, Jesus has done a lot of great things. He's healed demon-possessed people, but He started teaching about that He's going to die. And so this naturally raises the question of what's going to happen after that. Well, it says, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them. You thought there was just 12. No, there was a larger group. 72 others, and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of Him to every town and place where He was about to go. And He told them, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into His harvest field. In other words, not only do I want you to be initiators, I want you to use your influence with my Father, with our Father, with God, to raise up more initiators. I want more to be in the arena. And it's going to be your job, their job, to go out and to share the good news and to pronounce healing and to bring deliverance from evil. And so His reason for this is very clear. It's the same reason I talked about last week, that you want to be initiators. It's the same reason why we saw what happened in the Garden of Eden with man and woman after God created them and gave them authority and the ability to be initiators. We see there are other influences at work. And if you are not influencing, if you're not initiating, someone else will be. If you don't initiate, someone will. If you're not leveraging your influence in the lives of your children, in your marriage relationship, in your job, in your community, if you're not initiate, someone else will. Okay? And not all of those other initiators have the best interests of those people in mind. Their priorities are not always your priorities. So the question is, who's going to be using their influence and leveraging their influence the best? Who's going to be initiating? If you're not, I guarantee you, someone else will be. And so Jesus is sending His disciples out to be those initiators. I want you to spread the good news. I want you to be influencing. And we know this is the case because He tells them immediately after this. There are other influences out there. He says, go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Yeah, okay. That's a great motivation right there. You watch out for the wolves, okay? There are other influences and they will seek to devour you. They're out for their own selfish gain about what they can get out of you. And so be careful, right? Be wary. And this would be frightening. It would be frightening that the idea that we'd be sin like Jesus was Jewish, so He wouldn't say like pigs to the slaughter, right? I mean, they were Jews, they don't eat, pigs are unclean to them. But I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. He's saying that, and obviously that will be scary, except we belong to the one who has authority over all the wolves. The Lamb, if you will, who has more power, and we've already seen Him handle the wolves, and in fact endure a lot from the wolves, those who've been attacking Him. And so the disciples go out, and incredibly, it works. They come back, they're so excited. They say, Lord, the demons submit to us in your name. And Jesus says, verse 18, hey, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Yeah. The reason is because of Me, I've got more power than Satan. I was there at the very beginning. And then he says this, and this is so important. This is really a key verse for today. This is what he says to them. He says, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions. This is so powerful. If you could live into this reality, I have given you authority, because he's not just speaking to the disciples. This was written by Luke to say this is for all of us, okay? All of us who belong to him, believe in him. I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions. He's not just talking about, moccasins and things. He's talking about like spiritual forces of wickedness. We've seen that represented in the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, because he says, and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. I've given you authority over the evil one. You're like lambs among wolves, and this is what's so ironic about all of this, is those who are meek and those who are humble, and maybe those who are not wielding worldly influence and power like we imagine it, they carry the spiritual authority. He says in verse 20, he says, don't rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. In other words, don't be thinking you're the big shot just because I'm giving you authority over evil spirits. No, the most important thing over forces of evil, the most important thing is that you belong to me. There's where your power comes from. There's where your authority comes from. It comes from your relationship to me. So how would that change that opposition or the fear that you experience in daily life if you knew that the authority, that you carried the authority of Jesus? He continues in verse 21. He says, at that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, he just praises God. He says, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. It's not those that you would expect. It's not those who in the halls of power who carry the real authority and influence. It's the meek. It's the humble. It's those who are unassuming. It's those who maybe the world doesn't recognize or really care about, but they're the heavy hitters in the kingdom. Verse 22, he says, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows who the Son is except the Father, and no one knows who the Father is except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So in other words, your authority, the power that I'm giving to you, doesn't come from you. Okay? It comes from the Father, who has given this authority to me, and I am giving it to you. It's come from the Father. It does not originate with you. And so we could say that ultimately it all comes down with our relationship with Jesus. And we could say that your ability to initiate will be influenced by how we relate to Jesus, at least to initiate for what really matters. And I know that for me, that some of the people that had most influence in my spiritual life growing up, and as I was answering a call to ministry, looking back, they weren't perfect people. Sometimes they were impatient. They were worried, afraid, would get angry, sometimes even kind of lashing out. They were not perfect. Just like none of us. But they were bold enough to believe God. To believe that God could do something incredible through them. It all comes down to our relationship with Jesus. And it's not a matter of whether we are loved by Him. We are loved by Him, okay? There's nothing that you can do to change whether His favor, His love for you. But it does influence how you live out your life, whether or not you believe that. Whether you walk in that. Whether you, in a sense, could say claim that. That it's not based upon you, but it's based upon what He has done for you. So we could sum it up like this. Sum up the first 3 weeks of the series, in case you missed the last two, we could just go back. We could say that God created us to be initiators. God created human beings in His likeness, in His image. And that doesn't mean that we look like Him. It means that we were created to have authority like Him. He said He created us in His image and then to rule over the birds of the sea, the birds of the sea, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and all of that. He created us to rule. But what happened is that we advocated that authority. We advocated that responsibility. Our ancestors, and we've been doing the same thing ever since, believe what the serpent said over what God said. And it created this great shakeup. Then instead of taking responsibility, the man blamed the woman, and the woman blamed the serpent. They didn't take responsibility. We advocated that authority, and someone else is in charge. But here's what's happening. Here's what's happening in Jesus, and here's what the disciples are discovering, is that in Jesus, that authority has been reinstated. Jesus has reinstated that authority to reclaim that image that was given, that's been lost, to be restored, to restore us back to that place of favor and authority that we originally had. Jesus has reinstated that authority. And so that's why it's such a big deal what He says to His disciples. He says, I'm giving you authority. And we see this depicted in other places in Scripture. In the book of Revelation, which some people look at Revelation as just these things about the future, but I look at more as here is a spiritual a description of what's happening in the spiritual realm. Okay, it's described in a vision. In the book of Revelation, so often those who are believers in Jesus are described as wearing a crown. Okay, and in Revelation chapter 5, there's a song of praise. This is really our theme verse for this series, a song of praise to the Lamb, who is Jesus. And this is what those who are around the throne, there's living creatures, 4 living creatures and 24 elders, and they're giving praise to the Lamb. And this is what they say of Him. They say, you are slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. Okay? Everywhere, all over the world. The people who belong to you, you purchased them with your own blood. And here's what else. You didn't just save them, okay? You made them to be a kingdom and priests, those who represent God to the world, to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. They will reign on the earth. Some people look at that, it's only about the future. I don't think so. I think He's speaking about authority that's given to us now. Later in Revelation chapter 12, this is described as well. There's a description of a battle that takes place, and there's a dragon that seems to represent Satan, and there's a woman, and perhaps this woman represents the people of God. There's different interpretations about all these things. But there's a voice that speaks from heaven in the midst of this. And it says, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of His Messiah. Some people think this is only speaking about the future, okay? But Jesus said at the end of Matthew's gospel, He said, all authority has been given to me. It's now. This is now. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, this is a reference to Satan, which means accuser, has been hurled down. Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Okay? He's the description of what's happened. This Satan has been thrown down to earth, okay, which means he wreaks havoc on the earth. But here's what's verse 11. Look at this, okay? They triumphed over him. Who is they? It's those who belong to the Lamb. It's you. You and me. They triumphed over him. How? By their own strength? No. By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. It's not what they did, it's what Jesus did, and just their witness to what He did for them. And these people were it's the real deal that they're willing to give their lives, and some of them do in the battle. They triumphed. And so we see what the work of the harvest is all about. the harvest field, what you are doing in the harvest field when you initiate, you are bringing the reign of Jesus. He already reigns over all. He already has all authority. But you are bringing that authority to bear in your life, in your household, in your school, in your job, in your community, in this community. You are a witness to the powers of darkness, of their ultimate demise and of their doom. You are. By your confession of faith in the Lamb. And so you shouldn't be surprised that when you initiate, when you step out as a bearer of the witness of the demise of the power of darkness, that they won't like it. You should expect kickback. And if you've ever initiated, you know they do. So you should expect someone to retaliate when you initiate. Expect retaliation to your initiation. When you try to take steps for your own personal health, whether it's battling some addiction to be free, whether it's for the well-being of your family, for your marriage, for your children, whether it's really deciding you're going to pray, that you're going to start to pray and you believe in the power of prayer, expect it, man. Your phone's going to start buzzing. Everything's going to try to, if you try to, okay? If you try to take steps for the good of your community to initiate, to establish the reign of Jesus, expect retaliation to your initiation. Don't be surprised by it. You'll discover how many strongholds the enemy truly has out there. But here's the good news. Greater is He that is in you than he who is in the world. And here's something else that's so important. And this is why Jesus knew this. When you go out into the harvest field, when you initiate, don't do so by yourself. Look at what Jesus did when He sent His disciples out into the harvest field. He said, the Lord appointed 72 others. And how did He send them out? Did He send them out by themselves? No. He sent them 2 by 2 to every town and place where He was about to go. See, in the work of the harvest field, in the work of carrying Jesus' authority and initiating, we shouldn't do it alone. See, difference makers are never lone rangers. Jesus sent them out with a partner, someone to support them. If Jesus didn't send His disciples out alone by themselves, we shouldn't undertake major initiatives in our life by ourselves. We need each other. We need a community of initiators. We need others to have our backs, others to support us. And God has given us that. There's a scene in the movie Gladiator, which was like right after I got out of college, one of my favorite movies. And in Gladiator, there is, of course, the emperor wants to kill Maximus, the gladiator, and he's put him in the arena of the Colosseum in Rome. And of course, he's rigged it. He's going to try to kill him. But Maximus gets his fellow gladiators together, and he says, the only way we're going to survive whatever comes out of these doors is that if we stick together. That if we work together. Well, the same is true for us. The only way we survive is if we stick together. And that's why one of the greatest weapons that the enemy will use against us is to try to keep us from our partners, to sow strife between us and to keep us away, whether it's coming to church on Sundays, whether it's participating in a small group or in a Sunday school class, where it's all kind of excuses that come up. I'm not feeling well. People are going to see me. They're going to judge me. Or, I stayed up late watching the game. Whatever it was. They don't use that one, right? That's definitely being a spectator. But the enemy knows that you're easier to pick off when you're all by yourself. In America, we love the Lone Ranger. We have the individualist mindset. But Jesus didn't. He sent his disciples out 2 by 2. We need each other. And that's why in so many respects, our well-being, not just our spiritual well-being, our relational, our emotional well-being is tied to how involved we are, how connected we are, that we're not alone, that we're participating in the body of Christ. Not just in coming to worship and connecting, but getting involved in a small group. And we'll talk about some ways that you can do that at the end of the service today. Difference makers are never lone rangers. So, who are your partners? Who are your partners in the arena? Who are your partners in the harvest field? God made you to be an initiator. And imagine the difference that we could make. Not if we're pulling by ourselves, but if we're pulling together. We're working together in the harvest field. And if you don't have some partners, find some, okay? We have groups here you can plug into here at Mulder Church. So, we are carrying the authority of Jesus into the arena. God has given us authority. And I've got 2 sons. Matthew is 3 and James is 1. And we got another one that's going to be born in a few months. And they are at an age where they can't have responsibility, okay? At least very little. We're trying to discover Matthew. We ask him to go downstairs and get something and bring it back, and he gets distracted and does something else. He doesn't. And so they have to ask for everything. He's 3 years old. Daddy, can I do this? Now, I don't want him to ask. But he's not going to do that for the rest of his life. When he's 30 years old, I don't want him to have to ask me for everything. I want him to take responsibility. And I wonder if the same is true for our Heavenly Father. That He delights when we ask Him. But sometimes there are some things that you don't have to ask. That you are given responsibility, that you know this is the right thing to do. Do it. Initiate. Get into the arena. So how does it work when we all have authority? And how does it work when we're all co-regents with God? Everybody's a chief, right? How does that work in community? How do we live together when everybody's in charge, right? Everybody's a chief. Everybody's given authority. We're going to talk more about that, specifically about how to do that next week as we wrap up the series in the arena.